Hi, I'm Helen from the Socialist Alliance. Bill Shorten, as you probably know, has just confirmed that Labor will concur with the Fair Work Commission decision on Sunday penalty rates. Now, the decision probably won't come down until after the election, probably around mid-July. But the Sydney Morning Herald polling reveals that Sunday penalty rates are very popular, even amongst the most conservative electorates, and that 70% of Australians support Sunday penalty rates. So how should the union movement respond to this betrayal by Labor?
I read Bill's comments that have been reported carefully, and I know which side of this argument Bill's on. He's on the side of keeping penalty rates. There's no lack of willingness on the side of anybody in the Labor movement on this issue. Like, there's not a single person on the Labor movement side of these issues that's going to countenance supporting a reduction in penalty rates. It is important to not be so enthusiastically looking for the crack in the argument to exploit between our friends on the left to try and sort of point the finger at one part of the show and say there's this sort of betrayal of the show. I'm pretty comfortable with Labor's support and almost everybody else in the Parliament's support for penalty rates, except for the Liberal National Party and poor old Bob Day from South Australia. Apart from that, really, that's the consensus. You're right. It's a consensus because that's where the community's at. It's the consensus because that's the fair thing, and it's the consensus because economically, like, actually, if you're interested in the future performance of the economy and equity in the economy, penalty rates are a very important vehicle for protecting that. I'm very confident that what we'll have is a very strong Labor Party position on penalty rates. We'll have a very strong position coming out of the election on penalty rates. I'm not too perturbed by the gotcha stories in the Sydney Morning Herald or anywhere else on those issues. Mel, did you want to?
I think that's right. If you go to what Bill said, he said the Commission will make decisions on the submissions and the evidence that has been put forward. And like our questioner said, you say 70%, and maybe that was in the Herald poll. Our polling says 80% of people support penalty rates. They support them in regional New South Wales as much as they support them in the city, because if you're earning penalty rates, you can spend money in other people's businesses. It's what keeps our economy going. And I just want to reiterate that the Turnbull government and big business, and now, Martin Ferguson is part of that big business voice, is saying that this is inevitable. It's not inevitable. 80% of Australians think that people deserve to be compensated on the weekend. It's not inevitable. Don't get sucked into this bullshit argument that our society has changed. We need to ensure that penalty rates are there. And in the court, where submissions and evidence and very expensive lawyers are putting forward evidence, no evidence was able to be put forward that said that jobs would be created, that businesses would be lost. It's rubbish. So I just think we should not be getting sucked into having a whack at Labor on this one and actually be getting behind the Save Our Weekend campaign.
I'd like to ask whether the Liberal government is trying to destroy the manufacturing industry. I mean, they don't care about destroying TAFE or letting TAFE be destroyed. Whether they realise it's happening or not, I don't know. But what's the connection? Do you think they wouldn't want to destroy the manufacturing sector?
Look, it is very hard to understand the approach that the government's taken to manufacturing and engineering jobs, except through a political prism. The decisions on industry policy appear to be motivated through no other lens really than saying we want to drive these industries offshore. We want to change the shape of the Australian economy. I think we've moved from a proposition where you would engage with a Labor government on these questions of industry policy, and there would be a contest between those people who would want a more market-based approach or a more interventionist approach, and that would be the dynamic that you would be dealing with. And you used to deal with a Conservative government on these questions, and they would be strongly in favour of a free market approach. I think we've shifted from that approach with the Conservatives to sort of bugger the market. Let's just do what we can to drive these jobs away. A sort of hostility to blue collar work and the people who work in those industries that's very hard to fathom. Why? On what planet really would you have a Treasurer in the Commonwealth Parliament really giving the finger to Ford and Toyota and Holden to say, you know, like really, just piss off, was the message. And they did days later. And that's 40,000 jobs in South Australia and Victoria right there. The decisions in shipbuilding, the decisions in, you know, whether it's Electrolux in Orange, which closed its doors last week, used to employ 1,500 people in Orange and sustained a regional community with, you know, good high quality jobs, well-paid jobs in a regional community, driving those jobs offshore. Tens of thousands of jobs disappearing. Now, I don't think the manufacturing industry is the only place where people get good jobs. And I don't think, it should be the sole focus. You know, there are other areas of industry policy that we ought to engage in. So there's much industry policy to say, you know, we want a future for decent childcare jobs. I actually want to build the skills and the jobs in that industry because of what that industry can do for people. But really, what is going to happen in our suburbs and our regions if the manufacturing industry is driven offshore? What jobs can young men and women coming out of high school in the Hunter Valley aspire to if the train industry, the steel industry are all ripped away as opportunities? So it is one of the, as I said at the outset, really with a joke, it's a tough time in Australian manufacturing. It's a tough time for the people who represent the workers in Australian manufacturing. We've got to fight for a future for decent jobs. I think we'll drag this government back on the question of the future of the submarine project and the future of some of our shipbuilding projects, and that will produce many tens of thousands of jobs. But it is an uphill battle with these people, that's for sure.
It seems to me that there's a lot to be gained from linking up the questions about wages, job security, working conditions with these broader macroeconomic and international questions. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to give more power to multinational corporations that will make Labor more subservient to their interests and inhibit the capacity of national governments to regulate their activities. And the Panama Papers show basically that the people who are making a lot of money out of international capitalism are hiding it from the taxation authorities. Now, it seems to me that those elements need to be part of the broader story about the interests of Labor, particularly in the context of the forthcoming election. So I'm wondering how you see those issues being woven into a campaign around the more workerist issues that you focused on already.
The way United Voice is dealing with this issue is that even if most of our jobs have been contracted out and what were government-funded jobs are now, subcontracted out, or in home care are now funded, they're still funded by government. In early childhood education, that's still funded by government, even though, private employers are the norm. We have spent a lot of time working with other organisations to really bring this out into the, out into the sunlight. We've been part of the Tax Justice Network. We've been putting the research in to identify who are these companies that are getting away with murder. And that's a really important piece of work, and we fund people to do that work because no one else is doing, it's not out there and unions aren't talking about it. The other thing that we do in our union, and I'm pretty sure that Tim's union is the same, is start to talk about it with our members, because they have, started to believe the hype that if they just wait long enough it might trickle down, but it hasn't, and it doesn't seem to be, and they need to understand how this works. So our members have been forefront at going into different inquiries in the Senate to actually tell the story about why is a cleaner that works for Spotless paying more tax than the company. So we need to make this a whole lot easier for people to understand. We need to make it real for members of ours and for workers generally, so that they can understand that they are totally being ripped off, that they actually can do something about it, and we do need to make it part of the broader argument, and that's how we're trying to deal with it, is by educating and getting our members involved in that campaign.
It's not a surprise, I suppose, that a Prime Minister who was a merchant banker and had some engaged in some pretty elaborate and creative tax designing arrangements as opposed to a Royal Commission into the banking industry, and unenthusiastic about ASIC having the capacity to follow I can never remember the name of the law firm in Panama, but anyway, to follow through the hundreds of Australian individuals and front companies that have been engaged in this sort of activity. It does, for those of us who had a sort of beating heart and a bit of confidence in the way that, the whole capitalism show worked, it might have dented people's confidence a little bit, I suppose, over the course of the last couple of weeks. My organisation has, I think, made a pretty good contribution on the trade front over the years. I think there is a very strong reservoir of concern in the community about, in particular, the transparency issues around trade agreements. Some of the claims that were made about the China Free Trade Agreement, for example, frankly, on either side of that argument, they were on the fringe side of the sort of not the argument that people in this room would make, but I heard some pretty wild claims being made about the China Free Trade Agreement on one side of it. But my goodness, on the proponent side of it, you would think that on signing of this agreement that billions of dollars worth of trade opportunities would flow. I mean, I wander around the halls of Australian industry a bit, and I did make it my practice over the 12 months to every business owner or business leader who I met to ask them about the China Free Trade Agreement and what it would mean for their businesses. And apart from a couple of these guys who said they thought it'd make it easier to get in to see a government official in Chengdu or Shanghai, nobody could really say what the benefit would be for their business. So I just think there's got to be a lot better effort on the transparency front, and there's got to be a lot more honest assessment of what the benefits are of these arrangements. They're a sort of ideological obsession for some, and we have seen, I think, the Thailand Free Trade Agreement, the Korean Free Trade Agreement are why we don't have a car industry, really. So a much more careful evaluation of these issues in the national interest, much more transparency, because it is hard to get people engaged with the complex architecture of these deals, right? The moment you start talking about it, you can see people's eyes glaze over. So focusing on those transparency and national interest questions in a really sharp way, I think, is the only way of sort of engaging ordinary people in that argument.
First one's related to the ABCC Gestapo watchdog bully. It forces workers to, or union officials, whatever, to they haven't got their right to remain silent. Even the ICAC didn't have those powers. Anything to tell me about that, like how Gestapo it is. As well, the free trade deals we have. First, Tony Abbott signed one with Japan. Next thing, we're losing jobs to Japan, and then 20 billion subcontract to Japan. Do you think that free trade agreement had anything to do with losing the subs? And the penalty rates issue. Now we've got the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal in place. We've got to compete with countries like China, Taiwan, Japan, who don't have penalty rates. So naturally our penalty rates have got to go to compete. Do you think that's the major reason why they have to go?
Nobody's really here for the ABCC. It's certainly most of the things you say are true. I always hesitate really to use the references to to sort of Germany 1933 to 1945 in these arguments, but I appreciate the sentiment. You know, people's rights being taken away. Really, like there's none of the ABCC stuff that is really about corruption on building sites or safety. And all those issues should be, you know, dealt with effectively. That's not what the ABCC legislation's about. The ABCC legislation is about stopping people stopping work and going to union meetings and participating in things that, while most Australians might not like it, that brickies labourers go on strike or, you know, whatever it is, we do have to have trade arrangements that facilitate that development. The question is what sort of arrangements, whether bilateral trade agreements are actually a good idea in principle, and whether they're the most effective way of making sure that Australia's got access to international markets, or in fact multilateral agreements that are underpinned by decent labour standards and transparency and all the sorts of things I talked about. The future for the economy, you know, we want to be a country that makes things and not thongs, if you know what I mean. We need to be a country that's in the high value proposition. We are not going to be able to compete with the sort of Southeast Asian economies on the basis of driving wages down. We're never going to be able to do that. It's interesting actually looking at what's happening in China with wages lifting very steadily in the Chinese economy at the moment, and for many of the businesses that I deal with, wages are disappearing out of the equation in terms of the issues that they, you know, evaluate in terms of whether production moves to China or not. It's about capability, it's about just-in-time delivery, it's about a whole range of other things. And of course, the trade agreements has got nothing to do with why the hotel lobby wants to take penalty rates off hotel workers. That's just a straight grab for cash off some of the most vulnerable people in the economy.
I just wanted to make some connections, I guess, between the issues you're talking about and these trade agreements, because fundamentally all of the issues that we're talking about in the labour market, in taxation and in the other areas that we've talked about for a more just society require government intervention into the economy. And what these trade agreements are about are restraining governments from being able to have that intervention. The fact that we want, as a nation, to have the ability to regulate the economy and regulate the labour market, and what these trade agreements are about is actually giving more power to corporations on a global basis to stop that happening. They're also about tariffs and all those other things, but the new factor in them is giving global corporations more power.
Definitely, that is true. If your question is what are we doing about it, what we're trying to do about it is not only do the stuff that we've talked about already, but to organise globally. So we are affiliated to unions that do the same work as us in South America, in Asia and in Europe, and what we're trying to do is to work with unions in the vicinity, you know, people that we can work with and assist in Asia, in the kind of care sector areas, in these places. So we share skills, we share understanding, and because we share the same bosses, right? And what they do in one country, and if we can support unions and unionists and workers in one country dealing with Spotless, and they can support us when we're fighting, and I'm picking on Spotless because they are awful, but there's many other awful companies. If we can build that global solidarity, then we have to, and I know that the union movement globally is working on these issues, and I know that AFTRNet is doing a great job to try and bring this stuff up. So
the current framework the world seems to be operating is that countries have to engage in a mad race to the bottom for labor costs, conditions, and rights. And their proof of the pudding is, if labor is not competitive, the industry simply closes and jobs are lost. So my basic question is, have you got a framework to actually challenge that premise? Have you explored the ownership, takeover, and control of enterprises like what they did in Argentina, for instance? Have you explored the possibility of actually providing a universal basic income so that labor costs operate on what the neoliberals themselves claim is the most efficient pricing method, the marginal cost pricing method? Because if you take care of the basic needs of your worker, they'll be actually willing to work for free if the job is worth it.
I think that's a great question. I'm only speaking from my own perspective. What our union is doing at the moment is representing cleaners who are international students who have restrictions on their visas and have been exploited by cleaning companies, cleaning the top end of town, cleaning the companies, the Deutsche Bank, the big banks, the big investment companies, making sure that they've got their nice coffee and that their office is clean and their bin is finished, is emptied and their toilets are beautiful. And those cleaners have been threatened that by standing up and standing together, they'll be sent to Villawood, that they'll breach their visa conditions. But what we are trying to do is really put some energy into some prosecutions. It's all well and good to talk about this, but if we don't whack these companies over the head and there isn't a penalty to be paid, but that's a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of expertise, and really importantly, some really brave people that stand up and say, I'm actually going to sign this affidavit. I'm going to front up to court, even though my employer has told me that if I do that, they're going to dob me in and I'm going to go and get expelled from the country. Workers need your support to be able to stand up to these people. So there's a whole bunch, and we could talk about it at another session, about how do we make the contracting, the supply chain really work, so that if I'm working in an office and I'm expecting that my toilet is cleaned when I come in the morning, that the worker that is cleaning that toilet is not being exploited and not being badly paid. And it's happening everywhere. It's not 7-Eleven. That is, one of many, many stories. And those workers have really stood up. And I think that that's something that people don't understand, how scary it is in this day and age to stand up when there isn't a strong union movement. I definitely have thought about mutuals. I love that idea. There's a whole organisation of mutuals that are trying to do stuff in this space. They're a bit kind of corporate, but I think it's a great idea. Universal basic income, think that we should be thinking about it, and how do we do it? When I talk about a living wage, you start to think about that. How do we have a living wage in this country? What are we going to do? The old Harvester decision about a man providing for his kids and having enough smoke to smoke in his pipe isn't Australia today, isn't the modern economy. So I think those ideas are really important. I think that what you've heard from me and Tim tonight is that there's a bunch of people in the labour movement that are actually starting to think about this stuff and wanting to challenge the ways of the past, because we know that we are just custodians of the union movement right now, and we are in a really bad place. We are under attack. We are weakened. It's so much harder to organise workers. Workers are scared. They don't have workplaces. They don't have places where they can come together. They're doing 3 jobs. They're running around trying to get to uni and do better for themselves. It's really hard to organise and collectivise people in that space. And we're trying to think really creatively about how we do it. and we need the community's help. So I'm really, interested in that discussion.
There's a couple of things in there. Firstly, I think it's important to the old argument that jobs in my industries in particular are going offshore because of a competition that is about wages really misses the point about what is happening in Australian manufacturing at the moment. Many of these jobs aren't being lost because there's a wage competition issue. Many of them are being lost because of an underinvestment in capital, a whole lot of sort of bad decision making in Australian businesses. Look at Electrolux. Absolutely, there's a wages issue there, but my goodness, some of the decisions about investment in that firm over time and the approach of the Thai government in particular, where the new business has been set up. The wage competition issue hasn't been the issue. It has been the intervention of the government in Thailand to ensure that they've got purpose-built facilities and investment have really driven that decision making. Not a narrow question, a straight out competition between wages in one economy and wages in the other. If you'd advanced a proposition about universal incomes 10 years ago, people would have thought that you were loopy. I think I'm not sure I agree with the premise of why you advance that argument, but I do think we need to consider the impact of what technological change is going to mean for jobs and for equity across the economy over the course of the next generation. There's a lot of anxiety at the moment about Uber, right? Really, these people out there defending the sort of taxi monopoly and as if sort of taxi drivers and the old cab charge monopoly has been a good thing for taxi drivers and the people, many of them visa workers, been exploited by taxi driver owners. It's just bullshit, really. But it sort of misses the technological point. Uber's an issue now. The next issue for taxi drivers will be driverless vehicles. For truck drivers will be driverless vehicles. For workers in distribution will be distribution centres that are completely run by robots. The future of the waterfront will be, robots, perhaps run by a little control desk that could be in the CBD in Sydney or in Parramatta or in Dubbo. Those jobs are being written out over time by the technology, and the pace of that will only increase. Moore's Law, that nice piece of work that demonstrates that the uptake of these new technologies doubles every year. These things demonstrate it. When I came out of university 900 years ago, it was only Kerry Packer's kids and movie stars who had mobile phones. Now everybody has several of them, and our whole lives are run out of these things. The technology will continue to pick up. 3D printing will move from being a sort of niche occupation to being able to produce on-demand consumer goods, around the corner from you. So we have to think about what that means for equity across the economy, whose jobs have been affected, what jobs will exist in the future. We don't have to ignore everything the Business Council of Australia and their friends say. They are right about this question. 40% of the jobs that come out post-2020, we don't have names for now. Can't describe. That has implications for what are the old Sleepers Awake project. Poor old Barry Jones and that thing said there was a great promise in this technology. Well, the issue is we have to think through how we're going to run an equity argument to make sure that the whole community shares in the benefit of those developments, and that it isn't our people in the suburbs and regions who are missing out on jobs and missing out on economic opportunity.
Please join me in thanking the two speakers, Steve and Mel, for the wonderful talk as well as the great answers to all our questions. Thank you.